April 12th, 2026. We are in the 5th year and on day 48 since the start of the full-scale invasion. Welcome to the Situation Report. In today's report, we won't see many changes on the front lines. That's because today is the Orthodox Easter, which is celebrated on both the Ukrainian and Russian sides. During this holiday, there is a ceasefire, which is currently being more or less observed. We will briefly come back to this later, which is also why we are generally less active today, but also many other things. As I said, I have brought you a whole range of very interesting things, each briefly and compactly summarized in the report and not dragged out endlessly for 2 hours. It really hurts because of the algorithm, but that's the idea behind the videos. So, let's get started. Do you actually remember this video here? I showed it to you recently. A Russian soldier lay down on the ground when he saw a drone, and then he was hit by it. I already explained to you that this is quite a common phenomenon along the entire front, especially on the Russian side. These soldiers in training between 2022 and mainly 2023 were taught that you should lie down and then simply not move anymore. The reasoning behind it isn't actually that stupid. It doesn't come from nowhere. So it's not because the Russians are so naive and think that a drone won't spot someone if they just stand still. No, there's another reason for that. The first drones actually had a pretty limited range. That means that when they reach the target area, if they only have about 15 or 20 minutes of flight time, for example, they might see a vehicle or a soldier running away or something like that, then of course they always pick the high-value target because using the drone has to be worth it. Especially at that time, there weren't nearly as many drones around as there are now. Back then, there were, in quotation marks, relatively few drones if you compare it directly. And that's why you want to attack high-value targets. Yeah, a soldier who doesn't move and is less noticeable just isn't a high-value target. Besides, a lot of the cameras were just pretty bad in terms of quality. The stream was also very poor. And if there was a jammer, like some kind of interference device, or if the drone was at the edge of its range, then there was a lot of static. And this static meant that, for example, you could still spot a soldier who was running away better than a soldier who was lying on the ground or one who was hiding between trees. That's not the case anymore. Yes, and I showed you that. So that's what you were taught. Stand still or lie down. Just try to look inconspicuous, and the drone will fly right over you. Back then, it actually worked quite well in wooded areas when the drone flew over. And now, many soldiers still have that in their minds. They know it from their training, and now, for the very first time, they actually encounter a drone, for example, and then they simply follow what they've been taught. But now, of course, drones have evolved just like many other things, and that's why there are attacks on people who lie down, thinking they can avoid the drone that way. And I often read the comments under the videos, and many others also read the comments under my videos and send me one thing or another. And this comment in particular stood out regarding the video. I wanted to briefly address it. Here, it's being said that the soldiers are actually surrendering. That's obviously nonsense. Of course, they're not surrendering, especially not all of them. And those who did surrender made it very clear, as we've seen in past cases. For example, there's this one fairly well-known video where a soldier surrenders. Then the drone flew away. Another drone came, gave him a message, and instructed him to follow the drone. The drone then led him through a more or less safe corridor towards Ukrainian forces who had been informed and therefore did not shoot or wound this Russian soldier, but were able to simply capture him. That's called surrendering. What he's doing there, lying down on the ground, is not surrendering. How do you actually surrender properly, since we're on the topic? For example, you raise both hands high and kneel down. That way everyone knows you're surrendering. Alternatively, you can take a white cloth, a handkerchief, for example, any kind of fabric, a flag or something like that, and hold it up clearly so it's visible. Of course, in both scenarios, you should put your weapon down and not keep carrying it, as was shown in the video. The second part of the statement describes the killing of the soldier as a war crime. That's simply not correct. I'm not a lawyer, so feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. But in armed conflict, soldiers are considered legitimate military targets. That's a fact. And the fact that a soldier sees a drone and lies flat on the ground doesn't change his status. He's still a soldier. He remains an active combatant. According to Article 41 of Additional Protocol Y of the Geneva Convention, attacking a soldier who is out of combat is prohibited. And that's the case if, first, he surrenders without a doubt, as already mentioned, for example, by waving a white flag or raising his hands without a weapon. That's really an unmistakable surrender. Anyone would recognize that. Anyone, regardless of which country they're from or what language they speak, would very likely understand that this man or this woman is surrendering. Secondly, you must not attack soldiers who are unconscious or incapable of fighting due to wounds or illness. And thirdly, in all these cases, no hostile actions may be taken anymore. Simply lying down on the ground is legally considered taking cover or hiding, not as surrender, not as an unmistakable act of giving up. As long as the soldier is armed and does not clearly signal that he wants to surrender, he may continue to be engaged. And that's how it is. Otherwise, I could just lie down all the time. Just imagine we have to take an enemy trench. We attack this trench. We run forward, storm ahead. There's enemy fire. Some fall. Then the drones come. So what do? I lie down on the ground with my weapon in my hand. Then like this. Yes, now you shouldn't attack me anymore. I lay down on the ground. And then the drone flies over me, maybe targets another comrade. Then I get up again and move another meter forward. And then I see the next drone coming towards me. Wait. No. You can't shoot at me now since I'm lying on the ground, but it's pointless. I think we all agree on that, but I still found the comment interesting because it gave me a reason to do some research, and I was able to read a few new things again. Because there's also an issue with drones. Many of these texts were written before this drone warfare even existed. Drone attacks on individuals often raise ethical questions. And as you could see from the comment, there are many opinions. So, not always the facts, but many opinions are just heated tempers. But the legal principle should be that there is no obligation to capture. International law does not oblige a party at war to capture an enemy. That is not an obligation. So if this involves a risk for your own troops or is technically not possible, like with a one-way kamikaze drone, then you don't have to capture that enemy either. Especially if the enemy is not obviously surrendering anyway. So, surrendering to a drone is also somewhat controversial. Because you don't really know how to effectively surrender to a drone. A drone often doesn't have the capacity to transport or guard prisoners. And so, surrendering in this situation is technically extremely difficult to carry out anyway. Which of course means that it's impossible. But as I said, many of these texts and many of these ideas that people had back then and that they still want to implement as best as possible actually come from long before drone warfare. Despite the Easter ceasefire, we continue to see Russian losses that are said to have occurred today. As with every previous ceasefire, the fighting continues. Only the airstrikes have noticeably decreased. However, the fighting on the front lines continues. By the way, Russian bloggers claim that the Ukrainians broke the ceasefire because they attacked a village. On the other hand, you can also see drone footage where Ukrainian soldiers are being attacked by Russian drones. So as I said, it's like before, hardly anything has changed. They keep attacking each other. And I wouldn't claim that either side has kept to the ceasefire more or less, or has stuck to it 100%. The losses are still high. But as I said, the airstrikes on both sides have decreased. I also don't have any burning refineries or anything like that to report today. There are new high-resolution images showing how a Ukrainian Sting interceptor drone intercepts a Russian jet-powered Shahed drone at high altitude. A jet-powered Shahed drone like that is described under the Russian licensed copy Juran 3. That means if you ever hear about a Juran 3, that's the drone they're talking about. You can clearly see how things have changed. This is not the classic shooting up from the ground and hoping to hit something. No, it's a targeted interception in the air. Drone against drone, precisely guided at the altitude of the target. This is especially relevant with the faster jet-powered variants of the Shaheds. They are very difficult to combat, fly higher, fly faster, and behave differently in flight, compared to the less powerful Juran 2 variant. And this is exactly where such systems come into play. Instead of wasting expensive anti-aircraft missiles on individual drones, you simply send up comparatively cheap interceptors. It's not just one drone, 3 to 5 are launched. And even if only one of them hits and the other 4 crash to the ground, it's still cheaper than using a Patriot anti-aircraft missile that costs millions. while each Sting drone only costs us about $3,000. So that completely changes the equation. Now, the question isn't if you can shoot something down, but if you can afford to do it repeatedly, a trend we've seen for years. We were actually already there, or especially I was, since the first year of the war, saying that we in Europe should be doing more about it. Yes, of course, you can't intercept a ballistic missile with an interceptor drone. Of course not. For that, we also need ballistic missiles ourselves. But even in this area, we have to make sure that the air defense missile is still a bit cheaper than the enemy's missile that's trying to hit targets here. But what doesn't work is using a fairly expensive air defense missile to shoot down cheap drones. For that, you need a pretty good counterpart, and you can see that very well here with the Sting drones. A rather unusual system was spotted in the Russian city of Oryol, a ground-based air defense system equipped with R-77-1 air-to-air missiles. By the way, they're trying to use it to bring down drones. The picture shows an improvised launch device on which several of these missiles are mounted using aircraft pylons. The whole thing is very reminiscent of the principle behind Western systems like NASAMS, for example, just in a much more improvised version. And improvisation isn't necessarily a bad thing at first. But the idea isn't entirely new. Back in Soviet times, they experimented with using air-to-air missiles from the ground as well. Now, this concept is resurfacing, but this time not as a properly developed system or a classic military system, but rather as a pragmatic solution. And that's exactly the interesting part. Because the very need to use such improvised SAMs suggests that classic air defense systems, and especially suitable missiles, are in short supply and/or are being lost. At the same time, they're trying to make existing stockpiles usable again, in this case the R-77, which isn't a bad missile at all. And that's changing. And that also explains why it's being reported at the same time that even the Russian Air Force increasingly has to resort to older missiles like the R-27, for example, so ones that are still launched from aircraft. So we see there's a shortage of missiles, and now they're somehow trying to make old stockpiles usable, both for the Air Force and for ground-based systems. In the Rudinsky area, there's been an extremely tough battle for more than 2.5 months over a seemingly insignificant position, strips of forest along an old railway near the former Rudinsky mine. Well, what do you think about that? A strip of forest. Is it really that bad? I mean, it's located right here at this spot. Here's the railway line, and here's a strip of forest. How can you fight over a strip of forest for 2.5 months? The answer is simple. Russia's 5th Motorized Rifle Brigade is mainly attacking. On the Ukrainian side, units of the 4th National Brigade are defending, supported by the 425th Assault Regiment Skala. What sounds like just a few trees that both sides are fighting over here at the blue pin was actually a prepared blocking position. For months in 2025, the line secured an important supply road between Belitsky and Rudinsky to the east. That's exactly why the fighting there is so fierce right now. The course of events can roughly be divided into 3 phases. In February, Russian forces were able to capture the first Ukrainian positions on the northern edge of Rudinsky, right here at this spot, and thus push Ukraine a bit further to the west. In March, there was a pure war of attrition. Russian advances toward the west were repeatedly stopped by Ukrainian counterattacks. In the process, units of the 425th Regiment in particular suffered significant losses. So it was not an easy defensive battle. Currently, you can sense the exhaustion on the Ukrainian side as Russian forces reach the mine ruins and try to establish a foothold. And this is exactly where the significance lies. If this position falls, it's not just a piece of land that's lost. Then there will no longer be a forward blocking position, which has so far disrupted movements from the east. And that's exactly what opens up the area behind it, much more. The Ukrainian Intelligence Service SBU has released insights into a prisoner exchange shortly before the Orthodox Easter. Nevertheless, this is now the 72nd exchange in which both military personnel and civilians were able to return to Ukraine. Such exchanges continue in parallel with the fighting itself, often without much attention, even though they are of enormous importance to those affected. What is especially important here is that this time, in addition to soldiers, civilians were also handed over again, which shows that it's not just about classic prisoners of war, but also about people who were detained, imprisoned, or abducted during the course of the war. Zelensky has confirmed that Ukraine has received more interceptor missiles for Patriot systems. One shipment has already arrived. More are expected to follow. This is about the best missiles, namely the variant mainly used against ballistic targets. Procurement is managed by several partners, mostly in the Middle East. It now has to be coordinated in part with the U.S., and that's not just a detail, but actually quite crucial. Because in the U.S., they are in a position to reliably intercept ballistic missiles, and this exact threat has increased again in recent months. Above all, there has already been a lot of talk about it. There is a need for missiles, and that's usually the problem. But without missiles, they are simply useless. And this is exactly where the report comes in, because it's not about building new capabilities, but rather about keeping existing ones operational again. And I deliberately put the report at the end of the situation update. On this topic, we should also take a look at ourselves. And with that, I would like to thank all subscribers, channel members, and everyone in general. Special thanks. Then it moves to the top level, designed by Ferdy Meyerhofer. Feel free to comment and see you in the next update.